All right. Thank you all very much for being here. Like I'm so far really enjoying. I guess the tensions that are coming about, but in a very productive way. And I don't mean just the opponent processing that has been introduced so much, and the masculine and the feminine so far opposing each other, but also genuinely the tension that seems to arrive from that in between space that we're also figuring out. So not just indeed in between two extremes, but also that there's generally something in our midst. And I hope to continue that today. Um, I'll briefly introduce myself for those of you that don't know me. My name is Aron. I teach. I am looking forward to do more research at Utrecht University. That's currently how I'm oriented. And my main research subject has been Nietzsche, and mostly Nietzsche as a religious thinker. And for the talk, what I will do is there will be, let's say, brief questions towards you as an audience, and they'll be introduced far more at the end of the talk. So at the start of the talk, I might have very short questions, and you're very free to have, or to ask, or to raise short questions demanding clarification. Maybe I went over something a little bit too quickly. And then for the end, I really want to have a discussion. And that is kind of related to the theme that I'm setting out. So as you can see, the theme, as it is right now, is Nietzsche and Christ. And I kind of leave it up to you, to this discussion, irreconcilable or reconcilable response to the meaning crisis. I kind of want to do this in three different themes that I try to overlap or connect as closely as possible to the theme. In some ways that's difficult, because if we look at the theme of the Breakwater Festival, it's the, let's say, the safer tide that protects us from the storms of online exchange. And if some of you know a little bit of Nietzsche, I'm curious, how many of you have ever heard a little bit of Nietzsche, or just, okay, that's good. How many of you have read a little bit of Nietzsche? Okay, so that's also quite a few. I think many of you know he's not at least in his writing, he's not particularly a sweetheart who's looking for, some calm from the storm outside. Nietzsche in some ways embraced the storm. And that makes him both a very productive voice, I would argue, in this space, and we're gonna go there, and also a very dangerous one. And we can see that reflected in Nietzsche's life. So what I'll start doing is I'll look at Nietzsche's life himself, and specifically a bunch of people in that life. Then I'll be continuing on to talk about my personal path. Nietzsche was there for me, I guess, in a time when I was very doubtful about Christianity. And in some sense, and whenever I keep reading, those doubts come back, but not, I guess, with the same force they had done so previously. And yet I can't say they're entirely without force either. But also to really look about, okay, if we have just discussed Nietzsche's life, can we then see what a different effect his writing might have on us? And then finally, to move on to places, how can we sort of house that tension that is being brought about? So not just indeed the tension as a storm, but actually properly house it. And in that sense, we do hopefully arrive at the breakwater, and then see what's his relevance to this little corner. So just to start off, I'm gonna talk about three important people. I will start at the beginning of Nietzsche's life, because some of these were introduced far later in his life. But to start off with Richard Wagner in the American pronunciation. He will be of major importance to Nietzsche sort of as a father figure. Then Lou Andreas Salome as perhaps a love interest, but also as maybe an example of a free spirit, dare I say, an Übermensch for Nietzsche. And then finally, I was looking at a third person, and I was like, okay, I guess I could talk about his sister, the problematic relationship he had with her, his sister that eventually ended up, in some ways, completely falsifying his work, and therefore has an awful reputation for it, maybe even Nazifying his work in some awful manners. But what perhaps shows up far more centrally in his life, unfortunately, and definitely something, I guess, for us to reflect on as well, is loneliness. So even though these are people in his life, they're also in some ways people that left him, that he has a profound, I dare say, like divorce with all of them at some point. And you can see that that's most reflected in his personal writings that were published not so much. So, like, let's say his personal letters, some of his unpublished writings. And I think this is of particular relevance because if we then look at his life, we can also see, okay, Nietzsche the person, even before his writing, becomes relevant to this little corner. Because, well, I guess there's one reason why all of us are here together. It's also to get out of that very specific, individual relationship to the screen kind of process that we're so used to, and to want to commune, and hopefully to create this space, to create new communities. So we can also learn from people for whom that didn't go so well. So to start off with Wagner, who most of you will know as a great musician, also a vicious anti-Semite. I actually told my students recently that in today's context, it wouldn't be entirely different had just out of the blue Kanye West approached me and told me like, "Hey, you're a great philosopher. I want to learn more about your ideas." And that's not to say that indeed Kanye can be reduced to his anti-Semitism in any way. I'm just saying the connotation was very much of a free thinker who doesn't care so much about what the mainstream thinks of them, has a very original approach to the art they're making, and is not afraid to go into controversial territories. Even when indeed that might come off as anti-Semitism, I think with Wagner it's more clearly the case than it is with Kanye, but that's another discussion that I won't be getting into right now. To discuss Wagner as a father figure, I first need to go and actually look at Nietzsche's parents. As many of you will know, Nietzsche is actually coming from a very strong, very pious Lutheran household. So his father was a Lutheran priest, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, and he died when Nietzsche was only about 6 years old, of a condition called softening of the brain, which is also, it's kind of unclear. It was a very popular diagnosis at the time, even though people don't seem to quite understand what it implied. And if we compare that to someone like Nietzsche, he also had similar fears that this would happen to him. And indeed, at the end of his life, he did go mentally insane. And the question is, to what extent was this related to something inherited, and to what extent was it perhaps magnified by some of his own psychological, mystical, philosophical undertakings in his own life. And then we have his mother, who is a far more, well, we just talked about this, but dare I say in the less positive way, a passive figure in his life. I would say that his sister, in a more important way, was directing. So she was more the active feminine part in his life, but his mother really played more of a passive role, also against his sister later on, so that she actually felt a lot out of control. And she almost outlived Nietzsche in some ways. So I think she passed away only a few years before he died, but at that point he was already mentally insane, but I'll get there soon. And if we look at the young Nietzsche, I think this is him at about 14 years old, kind of still without the mustache, which would later on come about as a mask, but we can see him posing sort of as a almost Napoleon-esque, Napoleon would become a very important figure for him. And already being interested in, even though he's a very pious young boy here still, so he's still very much believing in God, he also becomes interested in military values. So there seems to already be this tension coming up here. And it's kind of difficult to really pin this down when this started. But I would say that Nietzsche, in a very important manner, he was called the little priest, So like he was, and you can look at his old writings, it's some of them are actually filled with prayers to God, saying he's going to dedicate his life to God. And at the same time, we see someone coming up incredibly smart, incredibly talented, that when he starts to go to school, to university, he becomes interested in the classics, and he is afraid that something has been lost. So that's something that is worthy of context. I actually have a brief question for you, Paul. Can you tell me a little bit about what was it like sort of to grow up in a household where your father was a pastor? What kind of expectations are there on you, so that we can maybe understand Nietzsche the person a little bit better?
My parents didn't put any expectation on me with respect to following in the family business. My father didn't put any of that expectation on me. Others in the church, they'd call me Little Rev.
So
I was the only son. I had two sisters. So there was some of that. And I know that I did internalize that pressure. And so then I, in many ways, responded against it for a very long time. That I was not going to follow in my father's footsteps, even though I eventually did. But I self-consciously tried very hard to not do that.
and how come you eventually did? I know that might be a long story, but tell me, like, how did you get over that pressure? Because clearly, like, for Nietzsche, this stayed an issue. So I want to stay with attention a little bit.
It came in stages. So I decided to go to seminary because I found I enjoyed theology, and I liked biblical studies, and I liked leading Bible studies and doing the ministry that was appropriate to a college student. So I went to seminary and I said, I'm going to go to seminary, but I'm not going to pastor a local church. So then after that, I went to become a foreign missionary. And I said, okay, I'm going to be a foreign missionary. I'm not going to pastor a local church. But then when, for certain reasons, we came back to the States, then I tried hard not to pastor a local church. And then I very quickly realized, why am I resisting this so much? That's dumb. I could actually make a better living and enjoy what I was doing more if I did it. And so I found myself doing something very, very similar to what my father did, and very quickly deciding, I really like this. So it was a process of resisting and slowly giving in to what seemed to be what I was suited for.
Right.
So eventually I gave into it and found I enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's actually, God bless your soul, because I guess that is a much better path eventually. Even though, than what happened to little Nietzsche. Even though maybe his name, I'm not sure yet, but his name might be more famous in world history. But we'll find out soon enough, obviously. Yes, because Nietzsche, like he was not satisfied. So he really felt, and this is partly to do. So I'm curious if it also played a role, but we can talk about that later. Like the fact that obviously his father had passed away. So for him, it was just this attachment to the spiritual father, and he is trying to see, like, is that enough by itself? And I don't think he's properly been able to struggle with the trauma of losing his physical father. So we now find that maybe at a later age, when he starts studying, he takes up the works of Schopenhauer. Some of you who have maybe followed, it's a great picture. Some of you have maybe listened to Jan Vervaeke's Awakening to the Meaning Crisis lectures, are a little bit aware of the context in which Schopenhauer operates. And it's kind of at this counterpoint of philosophy, where philosophy has gone through an enlightenment stage. So it became much more rational in some ways. We see the first critics coming up with people like Rousseau, but then at the same time, people like Kant then kind of saving it and trying to prove that indeed everything we understand in the world can be explained rationally, partly because of the structure we impose on the world. It's a very simple, concise explanation of Kant, because obviously it goes way more in depth. And we can see that people like the Romantics and eventually like Schopenhauer took some issue with this, because they felt that, okay, that's very nice in some ways that I can explain things rationally, but I don't really feel it accounts for my experience of the way the world is and it unfolds itself. It doesn't feel like it always conforms to these rational processes. And actually, if I follow Kant's argument to its logical conclusion, then it would be that, okay, I can only understand the world to the extent that I can study the rational structure that I impose upon it. And in some ways that means distancing myself far more from the world. So let's think about the Impressionists, the Romantics. This was a huge art movement. It became far more interesting to look at, okay, can I maybe get in touch with the world not by being rational, but by doing the opposite? Because if by being rational I get, away from the world, this is something that Vervaeke also speaks to, then maybe, and this was obviously, according to Vervaeke, a huge mistake, by being irrational, I can get closer to the world. And we see this somewhat, so people just do this methodologically in their art, for instance, in their poetry, in their visual arts as well. And someone like Schopenhauer, who is a great fan of music, and I'll get to that in a little bit more because that was an important reason for Nietzsche as well. But Schopenhauer has a whole metaphysics for this. He basically says that indeed what is ruling is not so much indeed our rational understanding of the world. No, that's actually profoundly disconnected with the way the world actually is, because the world as it actually is chaotic. It's an arbitrary will to live in some ways. And therefore, life is suffering. And we can see that Nietzsche, who was suffering, actually found, I would say, some kind of religious home in Schopenhauer. It wasn't a very optimistic home, let's be real, but it was something that he could house, for his time, his profound sadness over him slowly getting doubts about God and the role that God was playing in his life. Obviously, his own father passing away. And this became very problematic for him. And Schopenhauer, he had this thought that maybe, something like music, and in that sense, Schopenhauer was also Platonic. The visual art we have in our world, that's just, a representation of a representation, because it doesn't actually refer to anything directly. But something like music, it doesn't represent anything. It's just there. It's a direct connection with the world. So something like music gives us a refuge to go into where we can find that meaning. And that was something that Nietzsche took very seriously. And because Nietzsche was so focused on Schopenhauer's works, he slowly got a reputation. He was appointed a professorship at the age of 24, which was kind of unheard of in his time. And still is in many cases, I should say, definitely for me at least, so for many others too. I would say nonetheless that he caught the eye of some people, because there were other fans of Schopenhauer, and that's where I get to Wagner. And Wagner was also interested in, using music in this manner, but then also trying to think of okay, we don't need to just stay pessimistically sort of behind in this worldview. We can also, so Wagner called it Zukunftsmusik, so music of the future. We can impose this in indeed irrational way, the structure on the world. The structure is already too rationalistic, but we can impose this meaning on the world, and therefore we can't just sort of receive that from the world. We also have a will out of which we do this. So we have both elements, I guess the more passive element in Schopenhauer, which is pessimistic, and then Wagner, which is very optimistic and is very initiative-taking. And this is something that spoke to Nietzsche very profoundly, and he first met Wagner when he was invited to his house. Me and my partner Madeleine, we had the privilege of visiting this house last year. It's a beautiful house in Luzern in Switzerland. It's called Tripschen, and we can see the Pilatus mountain in the background, and that's where Nietzsche and Wagner actually had a lot of mountain walks together. And this Nietzsche eventually, he became such a consistent guest that he got his own room. So Wagner really became a real father figure for Nietzsche in some ways. He was far older, but he really took him up as sort of this maybe adopted son. And this was kind of interesting because in some ways we can also see other people saying Nietzsche was always so happy because every Sunday he went to his God. That's what some people said about him, referring to Wagner. So it's really interesting that actually he finds this religious homing in Wagner. And at the same time, I also have to talk about, what eventually happens between them. And that's a super long story. It's complicated, and it's partly due to some miscommunications on their behalf. But at some point they get the sense that maybe Nietzsche is not so sure of Wagner's project anymore, and he visits a little bit less often. And Wagner and his wife, Cosima Wagner, who's the daughter of Franz Liszt, they take that kind of personally, and it becomes very passive-aggressive. It gets to the point that Wagner starts wondering, maybe Nietzsche isn't entirely healthy, maybe I should message his his doctor and see what is he doing precisely. Maybe he needs a healthier sex life, because he was concerned that Nietzsche actually wasn't having a healthy sex life. So there's all these points where when Nietzsche found that out, he was actually very much obviously taken aback. I also wouldn't appreciate if just this friend of mine actually informed my daughter, with my doctor, complaining about my sex life or the lack thereof. So you can imagine this was quite a shock. But that wasn't the only thing. It was also that Nietzsche actually he noticed more so in Wagner, not so much now the symptom of promise, like, okay, we can think of a new future, but actually a profound escape. And in the whole of Romanticism, and this is when he became anti-romantic, he actually saw like this is just an escape from life. They're just trying to find it in music because they find life intolerable. And in that sense, he also noticed that with Schopenhauer, these are very pessimistic people who have a very pessimistic view of life and are therefore still framed, still closed off, boxed off, sort of in this, I would say 19th century Lutheran, I should be careful with my words, obviously, but Christian frame, where lots of life is about negation. It's about being careful with affirming it too much, because maybe that is a sign of pride. So this is sort of unfortunately, the separation he experienced with Wagner. And that leads us then to Lou Andreas Salome. And she's a woman, she's a Russian woman, very interesting. After becoming familiar with someone like Nietzsche, show a picture of her, she then later on went on to befriend Rilke, and then later on Freud. So some people actually think that some of Nietzsche's ideas arrived at Freud through Lou Salome. And she was this very interesting intellectual from Russia, and very, very dominant and very intimidating in some ways to Nietzsche, but he could just not stop thinking about her. So in some ways he was very much in love with her when he found her, but at the same time they were also very concerned, maybe like we shouldn't be conventionally getting married. And then she was also interested in Paul Rée, who was another intellectual at the time, and they actually had kind of like a three-way relationship going on for a while, which Nietzsche was also a bit ashamed of, but he also didn't want to be ashamed of it because that would be too Christian if he was ashamed of a three-way relationship. So it became kind of interesting that for some point, they really saw huge potential in each other. And he really felt that she understood his ideas. He even told her at some point, like, okay, I actually thought that you were the first person who was fit to actually live up to the ideals that I set forth in my philosophy. I discussed this with my dad, and he thinks he was just trying to get laid. But still, I think it's a I still think it's a useful idea. And this is her a little bit later. And one of the most famous pictures is actually this one, which is interesting because Nietzsche he's written many awful things about women. Actually, one of the texts that I can quote that he released shortly after this incident, when he also had his huge breakup with Lou Salome, is, "If you go to the women, don't forget the whip." But in this case, we actually see it the other way around. It's where Paul Rée and Nietzsche are standing next to each other. This was actually also taken in Lucerne, and she is holding the whip. So maybe that relates to the conversation we were having previously about the power of the feminine, even though this might be seen as a bit masculine, I guess. And that leads us, I guess, to this is definitely staged. That's correct, yes. That leads us to the last theme of the people in his life. Let me see. Okay, that's the time. Which is the loneliness phase. And this is just to see that, okay, Nietzsche tried to find a father figure in someone like Wagner and tried to really find some substitute for both his own father and maybe to some extent for God, also in Schopenhauer. And then he finds this is impossible. So he tries to set forth an alternative philosophy where it's not about finding it in other people, but actually finding it in yourself. And yet Nietzsche arrives at the paradox, like, okay, I want other free spirits, which actually shows that he's maybe not entirely the ideal that he wants to set forth himself. And then we get to indeed the phase of his life, and that was kind of the same case before this, but especially after the breakup with Lou Salome, that we see that he is far more lonely. This is also, I have won't tell it now, but I have a nice story about this rock when I visited it myself. But this is the rock where he came up with the thought of the eternal return and also the thought of his famous figure Zarathustra. And it's almost like after this point, he escapes into figures of maybe some would say his imagination. And that's people like Zarathustra. So it's a religious figure that he becomes very much interested in, but it's not actually someone that exists as a physical person in his life. And the same thing could be said for someone like the Greek god Dionysus. And in both these cases, these are profoundly religious individuals. So he's finding a refuge in them that he can't find in other people. He's finding them as a sort of a religious ideal for himself. And at the same time, he's still confronted that that's something he's only doing by himself. There's not really someone who can actually do that with him. I'll have more to say about Dionysus in a little bit. And yet, at the end of his life, we also find a very problematic for him return to some Christian ideas. And that is when he discovers Dostoevsky. And that was something that shook him to his core in some ways. Because he felt that Dostoevsky was the first one who, like him, psychologically really understood how people were. And at the same time, Dostoevsky was able to square this with his Christian faith, where Nietzsche was not able to do that. And he actually noticed that when he was reading some of these books, that he finds feelings of pity and compassion come up. And he associates that so much with weakness now, with something that he's left behind, that now all of a sudden he still finds himself squared in this situation where he's started to embrace the Dionysian and Zarathustra, but at the same time, Christ still plays an important role in his life. The Danish critic Georg Brandes, who was very famous at his time for actually introducing new ideas into Denmark, discovered Nietzsche's ideas, and this was the first time that Nietzsche actually had the promise of becoming a popular individual, because he didn't sell any books, well, barely any, I should say, and now an individual reached out who had discovered his writings and was like, I want to just teach your work in Danish class. I want to tell Danish society about it. And interestingly enough, he was so inspired by him that in some ways he went further. And that's maybe a first discussion point, not for now, but that I want to briefly talk about at the end. To what extent can we go further than Nietzsche himself? Because he was very critical of someone like Dostoevsky. He was saying, okay, Dostoevsky is basically preaching what you call slave morality. How are you going to deal with this, And Nietzsche was like, I know, yes, I'm aware, but at the same time, I'm so thankful for what Dostoevsky has given me. So we see that Nietzsche is actually defending Dostoevsky against this criticism, kind of from a Christian place in some ways. And then in his writing, we find many more sort of sense where he's struggling with loneliness. So this is an image of a bird of prey trying to catch a little lamb, and that's actually something that some of you will know he'll use in his text to talk about, like the morality of the lambs is slave morality, because they condemn the birds of prey for eating them, even though the birds of prey are not actually evil, they're just doing what they're doing. So for the birds of prey, that's their master morality. They don't think about that, they just do. But the lambs, they do think about that. But he has this poem that he writes out and releases much later about being amidst birds of prey and finding that he is a self-knower and a self-hangman, and he is profoundly suffering, and he doesn't feel that he is actually one of the birds of prey. He is in between them, and he is falling into the valley. So it's very descriptive what's going on here. And there's even some letters that show up more so, I guess, in the last decade before his insanity, where he'll start apologizing to some friends, writing about Christianity, saying like, okay, this must have estranged you, that I'm writing so much about Christianity. But I have to admit that in some ways, it is the best piece of ideal life that I've ever encountered. So it's very interesting that he says that. And he says, and I've actually struggled on behalf of its ideals for all my life. So no one will tell you about this when they discuss Nietzsche. And yet in some letters, it is there that he admits that in some ways he's still profoundly influenced by Christianity. But then you look at other writings and it's fully condemning Christianity. So we still need to square that. And you might have heard that the moment he goes insane is actually when he's walking around in the streets of Turin. He's already released, I think he's released like 5 books in the last year of his life. And you see clear signs of megalomania in the books themselves. So I would say be careful when reading them. So he's already showing some signs of instability, for sure. And then he walks around the streets of Turin and he sees that a horse is being beaten. And actually very similar to the scene of Raskolnikov and Dostoevsky, he gets profoundly sad for this horse and starts embracing the horse. That's at least the story that is often being told, that witnesses have seen. And then he eventually ends up being taken to a mental asylum, after which he still does write some letters, but they're kind of gibberish. Even though one very important point is that in that gibberish, he sometimes signs it with either Dionysus or the crucified. So it's almost like at the end of his life, this dichotomy has come back in some ways. So we need to understand that too. This is a picture with his mother when he was already, unfortunately, mentally insane. And this is really, I think, at a very final moment. And people always spoke of that he still had this piercing look in his eyes, even though he wasn't present anymore. And then also after his death, he started to be discovered. So it's very unfortunate, but he started to be discovered when he was insane. And then eventually also, maybe he was called a martyr. Like there's art like this coming up where they have a crown of thorns around him to really interestingly overlap this with the image of Christ. And I know that I should hurry up a little bit more, so I'm going to go over the philosophy section a little bit more, going into his ideas, specifically starting off with Dionysus and Apollo, then the death of God, and then Dionysus and the crucified. And yes, we've already talked about this. I didn't just add this last minute, but it's clear that for me, that Nietzsche is really interested in coming about with a productive opponent processing. And this is why I think, like, okay, some people say, like, yeah, Nietzsche, maybe at the end of his life, he got into a mystical phase. Someone like Lou Salome actually writes a whole psychoanalytic book about him, saying that his philosophies just became surrogates for God for him. But I already see that at the start of his life, when indeed, he's finding Schopenhauer, that he writes The Birth of Tragedy, in which he talks about the healthy religion among the Greek people before the introduction of philosophy as we've come to know it. So before the introduction of Socrates, we have this balancing of the Dionysian, which is very, let's say, devouring feminine in some ways, and the Apollonian, which is more masculine in some ways, but also like they both have elements. McGilchrist actually argues in his book that this is a very nice right brain, left brain kind of overlapping. And we can see that they're in a good tension with each other. They create something productive. So the Dionysian much more related with very heavy aggression, with sexual rights, with lots of intoxication, and then the Apollonian much more with clear forms, very, I should say it's much more clearly defined art in some ways. And they stand in good oppositions to each other. But at the same time, he notices that with the introduction of Socrates, the tragedies that are being written also become less sort of trying to focus on the whole of life and much more on, let's say, what is ordered at the expense of the chaotic. So if we do it very oversimplified, Dionysus would be chaos and Apollo would be order, and they would kind of be, standing opposed to each other. And we find that with Socratic revolution, it's like, no, we need to look at the eternal ideals. We need to find out what justice is. And in that sense, the chaos of reality actually gets a secondary place as opposed to the order, which is something that we maybe already discussed a little bit today, that we can find in the eternal ideals. And eventually, after Socrates, Vervaeke reference, then we get Plato, and he actually systematizes this far more, which actually makes it worse, because then it becomes even more stable and more fixed. This is clearly a simplified reading of Plato, but it's nonetheless one that is historically relevant in the genealogical sense of how it's been taken up. And that's why for Nietzsche it was inevitable that the death of God was bound to happen. And I won't go into this for too long. We do know that indeed when he talks about the death of God, he says something like, indeed, like it's not just about the fact that God is dead, but as many of you have already heard emphasized, but that we have killed him. There's this collective murder. Like actually someone like René Girard will make a lot out of this, that Nietzsche is the first one to really see like, okay, we're collectively murdering an innocent victim. Something that Girard will take up in a very important manner. And he says that is the necessary conclusion of, in some ways, privileging this ordered part of reality. So let's say the Apollonian, which becomes Socratism, which becomes Platonism, which becomes Christianity, very simplified and unnuanced, but over the chaotic outburst of what reality can also consist in. Because then at some point, by its own search for truth, for for eternity, for stability, for stable morality, stable, how should I say it, truth exactly that exists in the universe, that actually ends up undermining itself, because at some point it finds out, well, maybe this isn't so stable, or maybe indeed we become so much in love with truth that we start doubting the very value of truth itself, and then we get into very muddy territory. And he actually says that even the people that gave arguments for the existence of God were contributing to the death of God in some ways, because they were still trying to systematize it in an important manner, and still trying to box it in, to contain it, to say something, I guess, lightly controversial at this point of the day. And therefore we have indeed like the madman coming up, which is a reference to Diogenes with his lantern, and then just confronting everyone, but also showing profound grief. And that leads me to the last point of his life, where he is no longer focusing on Dionysus and Apollo, but he says actually it's Dionysus and the crucified. And the way in which my own journey, I guess, profoundly differs from my own path, I should say, differs from the traditional understanding of Nietzsche, is that if you look at the traditional understanding, they say something like, okay, Dionysus has now become something like Apollo and Dionysus, and the crucified is just everything that Nietzsche hates. But then how do we account for instance, those letters that I mentioned? For instance, what he found in Dostoevsky. And for me, it's clear that Nietzsche is far more split apart. He's not like, okay, I am Dionysus and I'm going against Christianity, or to the extent that he is doing that, he's actually far more interested in seeing like, okay, maybe by doing this, I can actually revive one pure form of Christianity. And he even says, so like, I've started a war against the Christian ideal, not with the aim of destroying it, but actually because I think that ideals need strong opponents. So we still see this kind of promise or search for opponent processing, and yet at the same time, I will argue that unfortunately for Nietzsche, and therefore I'm curious what the status is going to be of this in this little corner, that it ends up becoming parasitic processing, where indeed still one seems to be dominant, or these tensions cannot be productively producing life. And then indeed we see this return to this image where he criticized the Christian morality for being a slave morality. At the same time, he looks at the difference between the Dionysian rites, in which someone is murdered and is just devoured, think about the devouring mother, or dismembered in some ways, as opposed to the Christian sacrifice. They're both sacrifice, they're both suffering. He's fine with both of them. He's just saying there's a different meaning to the suffering. And he argues that in some ways this glorifies life. It argues that it's part of life. That's just, that's why it's part of the right to do so. And according to Nietzsche, he is actually had profound admiration for Jesus, which is also why if you read his book, The Antichrist, it's very much against traditional and institutional Christianity, but it actually praises Jesus as a free spirit, which is very interesting. But he says the meaning of this event for many people came to be seen as a complaint against life. Life is awful, we need to escape life. And therefore, it actually fed into what he came to see as problematic in Schopenhauer and Wagner. So he's still looking for this productive opponent processing. Which then leads me, I guess, to the final point of my talk, which I'll try to finish up. And now I guess there's also more place if people want to ask questions, like to go into a discussion, because this is actually at the point where I have no conclusions. I have questions, and I know that might be a little bit frustrating, but hopefully we can arrive at conclusions together. So first of all, and I'm going to controversially combine the two of them, but we see a strong element of Nietzsche in Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, both positive and negative. And maybe some of you will argue against this. I obviously know there's important differences between Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate. And at the same time, there's this emphasis on the strong individual with all its positives, but also with all its negatives. That's kind of where we see that they become very much interested in you should be healthy, you should really focus on improving yourself. You should become powerful, not in the Marxist sense, but powerful, and you should have life, and you should try to foster that in you. And then with Peterson, it becomes a bit more Christian, because it's in service of your family, maybe the community, maybe more than that. It's always a bit unclear, I guess. And then with Andrew Tate, like obviously, no, we don't care. And that's the thing, that's the risk of this vision. Actually, one interesting biographical detail is that his miracle working diet of Nietzsche was meat and only meat 4 times a day. So to the extent that's a useful parallel, we can include that one as well. But we see kind of this fascination with, okay, I want to, embrace this Sisyphean task, right? I want to suffer, but in a way that is that I can make glorious, that I can make meaningful for myself. And the risk with this is that it's bound up with a profound sense of individualism. It's about like, what is my individual journey? And therefore, for some people, I found this very nice cartoon which shows this. It becomes Narcissus. It's like, okay, yeah, look at me, like and that's, if you look at the gym bro culture, which is also very much inspired by Nietzsche, but it's like they take a lot of pictures of themselves. They take videos of themselves. They're like, look at me, look at how I'm progressing, look at how I'm suffering to make myself beautiful, to make myself strong. And again, there is positives there. Like, we should not encourage weakness, but there's negatives about the opposite as well. And therefore we can ask, like, this is obviously what Peterson says is also the ideal, which is the Christian ideal. To what extent is this really obtained? So that's the first question that I have. And that indeed leads to the whole übermenschlich question, which I won't go into now. And second of all, we have icon carver Jonathan Peugeot, who is kind of, he understands Nietzsche in some ways, because he thinks that Christianity at his point had become much more moralizing, more moralistic, and in some ways a praise of weakness. But he also says, like, it's kind of unfair, because what Nietzsche doesn't realize, according to him, is that we can't really self-will in some way. So the will to power, even though Nietzsche acknowledges that actually we are not transparent to ourselves at all, there's all these will to powers in us. But this sense of, I'm going to create myself, I'm going to create new values, not even in the Petersonian, Jungian critique of it, but just the sense that we can self-will, that might lead us to deny certain parts of ourselves, that might come back to haunt us later. And that's maybe what happened to Nietzsche when, indeed, the Christian aspect of him came back, when he was trying to focus so much on the Dionysian, maybe too much. And that also, according to Peugeot, Christ is actually someone who is reconciling those opposites. So for him, it doesn't need to be this productive tension where they're just separate from each other, but also that they're in service of a higher ideal, but not to negate them, but to reconcile them. So they're still, that's why Christ, according to Peugeot, is the highest and the lowest, and that's why he's interested in hanging out both with prostitutes, but then also with tax collectors. So there's this very interesting reconciliation of opposites in some ways. And he's also very much concerned indeed about the gym bro culture, in the sense that it actually, even though it seems to embrace life, which is what Nietzsche wanted, it actually doesn't seem to embrace death, what Nietzsche also wanted. It actually is profoundly scared of death. Like, it's trying to, as long as possible, stay super young, stay vital. Actually avoid, okay, if you get any wrinkles, maybe add some more skincare. And in that sense, there's also something in this sort of Nietzschean movement, the Nietzschean vitalism movement that we see indeed in the fitness gym bro culture, that is not fully living up to this. And that's because maybe there's mistakes inherent to it. And then finally, I think what someone like John Vervaeke is really trying to emphasize is that someone like Nietzsche is very much aware, much more aware than other people, because he's incredibly intelligent, because he's criticizing social phenomena so well, that we're constantly deceiving ourselves. We think we're acting out of goodness, but maybe we're actually acting out of weakness. And that's something that Nietzsche is aware of. And at the same time, as Vervaeke says, like, he is not actually tied to any wisdom tradition that would be able to give him a machinery that could help him overcome self-deception. And that's why, in some sense, Nietzsche is profoundly tragic. And that's why Nietzsche is also interested in tragedy. He, in some ways, knows that he can't overcome all this self-deception. He can just be aware of it. He can just be super smart about it and think about the father of postmodernism, like as Nietzsche has also been named to be. It's like, we can show ironically that we're aware of things, but can we actually do something about it? No, we can just show our awareness about it. And that actually, if you look at a postmodern movie, lots of it is about the awareness that we can show. and therefore that he cannot actually profoundly cure the bullshit disease. And also, according to Vervaeke, he doesn't profoundly grieve enough over the death of God. I kind of like, now that I've studied his own life, I tend to disagree. I actually think that his whole suffering comes about the grieving of the death of God. But I still understand, if you look at his published writings, he's very quickly runs into like, okay, now we have to celebrate this event because otherwise it will just come back to haunt us. But also he sees in Nietzsche like, okay, yes, but he does recognize there is this, this opponent processing going on. And he really tries to look for this. And it's something that we might need in religions as well. And that also that it's this way of where maybe Nietzsche in some sense is right, that if we focus too much on one ideal, it will actually continually, especially if it's stable, if it's not fluid in some ways, it will not show parts of reality to us and actually lead to a sort of reciprocal narrowing, as opposed to two ideals that are strong, that maybe bring out the best in each other, just like two lovers can do that in a relationship. And maybe in some ways, the Dionysian and the Christian can also do that. So I'm getting close to the discussion part, but I quickly just want to close off with this. Whether and how we should deal with Nietzsche in this little corner, I'll come up with a few suggestions, and then I want to hear more of you. I think what Nietzsche indeed rightfully does is the opponent processing. This is, I know this is Better Call Saul, but just think of it as a court case. And I think someone like Agnes Kellard actually Better Call Saul is actually a terrible example of this because it's not entirely transparent. Yes, but someone like Agnes Kellard, she really points out, okay, when we do justice together, we actually also have opponent processing. Like, we're both pursuing one ideal, and in that sense it's a reconciliation of opposites, but not by doing the same thing, but by having a prosecution and a defense. And that's, according to her, actually that's something that Socrates already introduced. And I guess Nietzsche also has to teach us a little bit to see not just the weak Christian, but also maybe the strong Christian. At the same time, I'll respond to Nietzsche a little bit, like, how can we from this little corner not just indeed let Nietzsche help us critically examine what we need to think about, but also how can we critically examine elements in Nietzsche besides the the obvious, let me put it that way. And Nietzsche has this beautiful story of a transformation in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that at first off, there's this 3 metamorphoses in the desert, where the spirit first becomes, a camel because it carries the weight of basically religion in some ways. And then eventually it transforms into a lion because it's willing to fight. It's willing to fight against that religion, to resist the religion. I think it's actually there to fight the dragon there, and then it's like the dragon of thou shalt, and the dragon and the lion will say I will. And then finally it says like, but the lion in itself is not enough. We shouldn't just stay reactionary. Like, actually the lion still needs to transform into the child, and this is, by the way, one of the reasons why he constantly tried to affirm or emphasize the childlike aspect he saw in someone like Jesus. The child is able to innocently conceive of new values. And I think that's a beautiful point. And at the same time, we have to ask, okay, but the child, to who does it belong? Like, in which context? To which parents? To which community? And that's something that Nietzsche has difficulty answering. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I think we have about 8 minutes, something like that. Yeah. Okay. Just if people have just suggestions, maybe on how do we do this, because obviously I've tried to show both the strengths and the weaknesses of this. So is there anyone who might want to say like, okay, how can we properly house this tension, or is it just something we should just get rid of? I've tried to argue why it's important. Yeah.
Could you please do me the favor and explicate further, like, what exactly is the tension here? Like, is it this Dionysius Apollo thing, or what exactly are you?
It's indeed the tension where. So it's a very good question. So, what is the tension that is going on? So, as you saw the start of my talk, it was the irreconcilable response to the meaning Christ. In some ways, we could even say the tension between someone like Nietzsche himself and someone like Jesus, or someone like Dionysus, as opposed to someone like, well, at the end, the crucified. And again, the crucified is complex because it's not just Jesus, it's actually also the meaning of the symbol of the crucifixion. But to say like, okay, there seems to be a tension in many Christians turning the other cheek and finding power in that, as opposed to indeed self-willing, self-asserting yourself and finding power in that. And how do you find, for instance, balance in that? And that's something that Nietzsche's trying to point out. Like, should we always turn the other cheek, so to say, or should we also assert ourselves in an important manner? But I'm not sure. Like, maybe you have, yeah.
I think one thing that I'm really not very familiar with Nietzsche or the scholarship around him, but it seems to me that people leave out the fact that he knew the Christianity he knew was the Protestantism and Catholicism of his time.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't know Orthodoxy,
Mm-hmm.
and he.
You but okay. So that's interesting.
And the thing is, if you look, for
Yeah.
example, I don't know how it was like, what is it, 150 years ago.
Uh-huh.
But if you go around modern Catholic churches and you look at the what's it, Kreuzgang, the pictures of the crucifixion story.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
There's one picture missing, which is the resurrection,
Mm-hmm.
and so I assume that kind of plays into his philosophy, where he sees the self-sacrifice,
Mhm.
the giving oneself up
Yeah.
to the will of other people. But it seems to me that there's this very fundamental key aspect to Christianity, which is the resurrection,
Mm-hmm.
the victory of the bad things that come from this self-sacrifice,
Mm-hmm.
is completely missing there.
I do think, like, so I think it's a good question. At the same time, I do think that for him, the resurrection in some way still implies that death is something that, we should have victory over. Death is bad. Life is good. And I mean, that sounds like a very commonsensical thing to say, but for him it actually isn't. It still means that in some ways, there's this pessimism about our death and about our mortal life here on earth. So it will still lead us in some ways to, for instance, something he criticized as well, to say like, okay, a hereafter, well, maybe that is for many Christians preferable to this life, because this life is full of mortality. So even though I totally agree, there's a resurrection, it still seems to be that will be problematic for him, because it would still imply like, yes, because this earthly life here, it should be transcended. And that's, I guess, so I'm not sure if that would help, but maybe you can elaborate and say, or, okay. Okay.
Well,
yes, actually, like, yeah, that's and I think Thomas too, but you can start, yeah.
oh yeah, I was thinking like resurrection doesn't happen in a different realm. It actually happens in the same
Mhm.
the same material world. It's not like a different spirit.
Mhm.
It's more of a, let's say, a Burbachian different way of being in the world.
Mhm.
But you have to go through the transformation.
Yeah. This actually, I do think this probably ties a little bit to his understanding of Christianity, which was, in some ways, had become decadent, because Christianity in his time, what he could see of it was decadent. So maybe, that understanding of multiple levels of reality was not so present. And also the Platonic, you don't have like the Neoplatonic rising up of levels, but actually just like, okay, you just have the eternal world as opposed to this mortal world. So I think maybe you're right. If there is more nuance in there, it could be true. At the same time, he would be profoundly skeptical of relying on metaphysical interpretations of the world. He'd say like, okay, that's still metaphysical interpretation of an event that is going on. And that still ignores the profundity of the suffering in this life that we have to address.
It seems like he was reacting to the Gnostic kind of movement of Christianity towards.
In what way? Can you elaborate?
Kind of this like two-story
Mhm.
kind of way of viewing, like, oh, here's the normal world, and God is like
Mhm.
second story.
Yeah.
We have
The
access
the
only
two world
to-
mythology, right? In that
Yeah,
sense.
whereas maybe a more traditional Christianity would be like,
Mhm.
there's like intertwinedness. It's
Mhm.
like always present.
Yeah, that's true. And it
in
is
serious
possible. So
ways.
I'm not sure if the 19th century orthodoxy would have saved Nietzsche in some ways, but it is possible that some understanding of it would have. Even like John Vervaeke also mentions that every now and then, that he says like, I'm curious what would have happened to me had I grown up in Jonathan Peugeot's understanding of orthodoxy. So we'll see that. I think, Thomas, we wanted to say something. And then I think in a few minutes we'll need to finish up. And there will be more time, obviously, for discussion.
So it's no answers to your question. It's just some further questions.
That's good.
One, I would like to hear you about your take on Nietzsche's take on Plato.
Yeah.
Because basically that's his positioning, being the anti-Plato.
Yeah.
In that, which I think is very much related also to his relationship to Christianity.
That's correct. Yeah.
And in terms of if he would have appreciated Christianity as more oriented to salvation, there is one part of his relationship with Wagner that I find very significant. Basically, where he really broke with Wagner is when Wagner wrote Parsifal.
That's true. When he became Christian again.
Where he really hated Wagner for becoming Christian again. Where he really hated basically Parsifal standing also for the Holy Grail. And where he being Nietzsche kind of went in the other way and completely appreciated Verdi and Rossini for their life-affirming music versus this now death-affirming transcendence music. So in that sense, it's very much, and there's, I think I see this in the Plato context. It's anti-transcendence and completely diving into the aliveness of material life. That's the will to power, by the way, also of the will to life. Would just love to hear what you think about that.
I think you're really correct. He also says that Plato is already sort of a proto-Christian. He says that about Plato, and he finds Plato really boring. He calls Christianity Platonism for the people, and then he says that Paul, through and through, is very Platonic, and he really minds the Pauline understanding of Christianity, and then indeed he praises Jesus himself. So I think you're totally right in some ways, that actually there's lots in Christianity that he finds that he really appreciates. I think he takes issue with the development of Platonism throughout history. So not necessarily, if we go back to the source in Platonism, it was far more mystical. We all know this, like there was far more nuance to this. But just the understanding that indeed the eternal gets, a primary choice above the what is ever changing, that becomes problematic for him. Also because he is kind of Heraclitan and he wants indeed opposites to coincide constantly and not just to have the one at the expense of the other, which is what happened. But maybe I'm not fully responding to your question, so can you speak a bit more?
The point I wanted to work out and see your response to that. Basically, that his whole life devotion to the end seems to be a life, completely life affirming in the material sense of life.
Yeah, that's true.
Versus the transcendence sense of life that he really seemed to hate in Plato and late Wagner in this.
I would say this is a little bit, because I know you have a Heideggerian background, this is a little bit of a Heideggerian understanding of Nietzsche, where he simply reversed Platonism, and he actually, Nietzsche says that in his unpublished works that my philosophy is an inverted Platonism. So there's obviously something to be said for that reading of Nietzsche. That indeed, like for him, it's all material as opposed to the transcendent that is important. And at the same time, then I can square that very easily with this profound obsession with religious individuals. So he writes so much about Zarathustra, about Dionysus, about Jesus. So I still don't know how to square that properly, but I do see what you mean, and in that sense, I guess there is a reading that is valid, but I still think it needs this supplement. Yeah, I think we probably, just one question, or okay. Oh, okay, good. No, that's great. That's great. I thought, sorry, I don't know your name, but Dave's dad actually had a question. Oh, didn't you have a question? Did you have a question? Oh, okay. Well, then it's all good. Then I'm just gonna thank everyone very much again, and also thank you, and then I'll hand it over to Cassidy, whatever. Yeah. Okay.